Hey, what's up, guys? Britton here. Just want to talk today about why consciousness can't be understood by materialist science. I have 5 reasons for that, and they all tie in together pretty closely, but I'll do my best to kind of keep them separate, but also show you the connections between them. And that's so. I guess I'll start off by describing what I mean by materialist science. Materialism is the philosophy that all reality is comprised of matter alone. There's no purpose. There's no meaning in anything. We don't have free will. Everything's sort of predetermined by mechanistic cause and effect processes. So therefore, a materialist theory of consciousness would say that we are our brain. The mind is equal to the brain, and every decision we make, everything we think and feel that seems to have its material origins in the brain is nothing more than those biological processes. There's nothing else like driving our action or anything. So I have 5 reasons for this. The first one is that consciousness is too intersubjective. So it's not just subjective on a case-by-case basis. Like we all have our individual subjective experience and states of consciousness that only we can experience, that's separate from that of other people. But it's also intersubjective. Which means that it's almost objective as far as humans are concerned. Objective that we have consciousness. We all share this thing in common, that we are like aware of our environment, and we can make decisions that aren't purely geared toward our survival and instincts. But it's intersubjective also in the sense that it's kind of something that links us together. For example, when someone walks into the room and they just put off a bad vibe, it's almost as if you can sense like the evil of their motivations, and that's kind of a gut feeling that you have. It's not something that like, oh, you're going through all these specific scenarios in your head of like what this person could do in this room, like maybe based on how they look or something like that. But it's kind of a gut feeling that you get. It's an intuition, So yeah, consciousness, that has something to do with like consciousness and that non-mechanistic part of consciousness. I think. I don't think that feeling is grounded in the brain. It's grounded in the world outside, in that person, and like there's a connection there that you're sensing that is elevating your awareness. So anyway, the second point is that consciousness is too fluid. Your level of consciousness and awareness of your environment changes depending on what you're doing, and it changes multiple times throughout the course of the day. So, question: are you 100% conscious when you're totally sober, but sitting at a desk, staring at a computer screen for 8 hours a day, doing very repetitive work at your job? I would say probably not. You're not as conscious in that situation as you are, say, when you're like taking a psychedelic drug, maybe even when you're doing so by yourself, and your self-awareness is elevated, and you start to see meaning, and you start to like introspect very deeply. I'd say that's probably a higher level of consciousness, higher degree of consciousness, that is, than if you're sitting at your computer screen doing repetitive work. And that's it's another reason why it's so difficult to stay focused on one repetitive job for so long. It's because humans are very complex, and I think our consciousness and the fact that we don't really understand it very well, or at all, really, at least not on a scientific basis, is why we're so complex, and it's why we get distracted from our job. We're meant to do a lot more and meant to be aware of much more than just like one repetitive task at a time. So that's a sort of quantitative aspect of consciousness that is very fluid. It changes multiple times over the course of the day, but it's also this leads me to the third point, is that consciousness is impossible to quantify in a very generalized way, right? Because it's so fluid, we can't really nail it down. We say like, okay, there are these amount of brain functions going on in under this set of circumstances, and then all of a sudden it changes because our circumstances change. Our our attention is focused elsewhere all of a sudden. So we can't really pin it down. It's impossible to quantify. The fourth point: materialists try to expand objective reality beyond the moral reality. So as subjective beings, and more importantly intersubjective beings with this intersubjective consciousness, we have this idea of right and wrong that is not really scientifically grounded. One thing that science does, obviously, is it separates objective empirical matter from its context and its meaning and its purpose and goals and motivations, and then it just investigates that raw data like empirically. But the idea of the concepts of good and evil are very real concepts, and they're things that we have to contend with every single day. So leaving that out of the consciousness conversation just makes no sense at all, because to have a high level of consciousness, maybe when you're taking psychedelic drugs, for example, you might have like an elevated awareness of good versus evil. It's just consciousness is extremely variable in that way. And it leaves out the moral aspect of consciousness, and I think the biology, what's going on in the brain and in the body, that aspect of consciousness is really just a mere consequence of a pre-existing state of being, if that makes sense. And that state of being has to do with our goals and motivations and everything. And so the fifth point that ties into that is that it's transformative. Consciousness transforms us not only quantitatively, but qualitatively. And so what I mean by that is when we say when someone gets a good humanities education, one thing that is supposed to do is teach you about good and evil, teach you about the human narrative and the nature of human beings and why we're here and what we are and how we're supposed to act in the world, and how not to make the same mistakes that our predecessors made for the sake of the greater good of humanity and for ourselves individually. So learning about good and evil in that regard is it's necessary for our survival and propagation and our well-being, and it transforms us into a better person. So leaving out that qualitative aspect is leaving out more than half of the equation, I think. Because I think that reality, that moral reality, is much greater than what we can know objectively. When we investigate things scientifically, I'm a big fan of science, by the way. But when we do science, there's still goals and motivations that we have to aim that raw data toward. Without the goals and motivations, the data means nothing. So that's where good and evil comes in. You can either use science to build an atom bomb, or you can use it to cure cancer, and even those things may not necessarily be good or bad depending on how you manage them. So yeah, those are my 5 points about why I think materialist science is actually systematically incapable of understanding consciousness. And I'm not saying that there will never be a somewhat accurate theory of consciousness under the materialist umbrella even, but I think by the time that happens, what we consider to be material will be very, very different. It'll be well after a paradigm shift in which all of the subfields of science will start to talk and work together in a more holistic way. That's, psychology, biology, physics, neuroscience, everything kind of comes together and sees what in common exactly they're doing and how that's relevant to consciousness studies. And also, more importantly, even than the sciences working together, is the sciences in general working with the humanities and philosophy and literature and learning those things about human nature, that those why questions, those questions of reason, rather than the how questions that science is concerned with, about the cause and effect and the inner workings of things. So I think that merger has to happen for us to gain even remotely accurate theory of consciousness. And until that happens, science isn't going to be able to do it alone, and nor are the humanities, I think, going to be able to do it alone. Need to work together, man. That's why we have different personalities, different interests, kind of working toward the greater good. But and who knows where the state of academia will be by the time that happens. Hopefully, in a much better place than it is now. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll talk to you guys later. Cheers.